Podolsk, Russia, a suburb on the edge of Moscow, once known for its quiet streets and warm lights. Tonight, it lies buried under silence. The hum of the city has vanished, replaced by the eerie crackle of frozen power lines. Apartments stand dark, their windows glazed with frost. Families sit in the cold, clutching candles as their breath fogs in the air. The Kremlin called this a safe zone, untouched by war. But the images tell another story. This is not the front line. Yet tonight, it looks exactly like one. So, how did Moscow's own lifeline collapse overnight? On the night of October 21st, 2025, Russia faced one of the most coordinated and devastating waves of attacks since the beginning of the war. But this time, the targets weren't military bases or weapons depots. They were the arteries that kept the capital alive. Precision drones struck deep inside Russian territory, far beyond the front lines. For the first time, the battlefield shifted from Ukraine's fields to Moscow's skyline. This was not random chaos. It was the opening move in an operation designed to suffocate the capital itself. The first wave struck the Smolensk Oblast, where a massive power plant, one of the main suppliers to Moscow's western grid, was engulfed in flames after a series of drone impacts. Satellite images captured the fire stretching across the facility, visible for miles. Hours later, a second strike hit the Bryansk Oblast, targeting the Truev transformer station, a crucial distribution node that directed power into the capital's outer ring. Both attacks were confirmed by Russian military bloggers and local telegram channels, though official statements remained silent. Within minutes, entire districts lost power. Streetlights dimmed, communication towers flickered, and Moscow's energy flow began to die. What appeared to be isolated explosions were, in reality, coordinated blows to the capital's electrical heart. These strikes weren't random. They were part of a precise two-layer strategy crafted to choke Moscow from within. Phase 1, the strategic phase, began days earlier with deep strikes against high-voltage substations like Veshkheimer, cutting off the main power arteries that fed the capital from hundreds of kilometers away. Once those central lines were severed, Phase 2 unfolded, the tactical phase. This time, Ukraine targeted the smaller distribution points around Smolensk and Bryansk, ensuring that no backup route could restore the grid. It was a calculated sequence. Hit the generator, then destroy the valves. Every move isolated Moscow further, turning its once mighty network into a dead circuit. By the end of the night, the city's power web, once its greatest strength, had become its most fragile weakness. Once the main power arteries were destroyed, Moscow's entire infrastructure began to unravel. Without electricity, the city's massive water pumps stopped working, cutting off supply to thousands of buildings. The heating systems, powered by the same grid, went silent. Within hours, pressure dropped in pipelines, boilers froze, and generators failed one by one. Engineers tried to reroute power from western lines, but those too had been severed. What started as a series of distant explosions now echoed through every apartment, every frozen pipe, every silent street. The blackout was no longer technical, it was total. The heart of Russia had flatlined. As Moscow's systems collapsed, the human cost became impossible to ignore. In Podolsk, parents wrapped their children in blankets, their breath visible in the icy air. Hospitals switched to emergency power, rationing light and heat. The city that once watched the war on screens was now living it in real time. Videos flooded social media. Frozen stairwells, dark apartment blocks, and silent neighborhoods buried under frost. These were not images from the front line in Ukraine. They were from Moscow itself. The war had crossed borders without soldiers, without tanks. It arrived quietly, through power lines, and froze a nation that once believed it was untouchable. This collapse didn't begin with drones. It began with decades of neglect. For years, billions were poured into Russia's defense machine while the nation's infrastructure rotted beneath it. The government raised military budgets to Cold War levels, yet ignored reports warning that more than 70% of the country's energy grid was outdated or unsafe. Local operators patched systems with decades-old parts, and entire regions depended on equipment long past its lifespan. When the strikes came, the grid didn't just fail, it surrendered. Putin's promise of stability had been built on a fragile illusion, power that looked strong on television but crumbled in reality. The blackout wasn't simply an act of war, it was the consequence of political choices written years before the first drone took off. The road to Moscow's blackout followed a clear and deliberate sequence. It began on September 28th, when the first test strikes hit Belgorod, cutting local power and measuring Russia's reaction time. On October 6th, a second wave followed, proving the grid's weaknesses were deeper than expected. Then, on October 16th, a key transformer in the Volga region was destroyed, paving the way for the decisive strike on October 18th, the annihilation of the Veshkimer substation, Moscow's main energy artery. Finally, on October 21st, the twin hits on Smolensk and Bryansk sealed the capital's fate. Each stage was a calculated move in a five-step operation, tested, refined, and executed with precision, ending not on the battlefield, but in the heart of Russia itself. For years, Moscow's citizens lived under a silent agreement: give loyalty, receive comfort. That illusion shattered when even the richest districts went dark. The government that promised stability couldn't keep the lights on. Anger spread across social media as silence replaced trust. The blackout wasn't just electrical, it was political. The Kremlin's image of control dissolved in candlelight. Moscow, once untouchable, was now exposed, and the regime's strongest fortress had begun to crumble from within. In the end, the greatest irony unfolded. The weapon Russia once used against Ukraine, energy warfare, returned to strike its own capital. The strategy designed to freeze cities across the border has now frozen Moscow itself. The empire that sought to break another nation is breaking under the weight of its own design. This is not coincidence, it's consequence. The lights that once symbolized power have turned to darkness. The war has come full circle. Moscow's lights are going out, and the Kremlin can only watch.